I was looking through some websites on the internet that relate to both the self and to the concept of no self, or no inherent self, which is anatta. And as I was going through the internet, the information that was being presented by several of the websites just didn't quite make sense to me, and where I'm coming from and my own current understanding of no self, no inherent self. So this particular video is directly related to what I read and my criticisms about what I saw and why I have a problem with it and why I object to it. Anyway, before I launch into my criticisms of each of the individual web pages, I thought I'd let you know roughly where I was coming from in relation to my criticism of all of them, my current understanding, and why I've got a problem with this particular issue. Now, the self is anything that you consider yourself to be which is separate from everything else. No matter what it is, that is the self. And anatta is the concept that is not inherently true. That there is no inherent self. That's it. Many of the web pages seem to get this concept confused with something not inside something else. For example, inside a person, inside a body, inside a being. And that's not what anatta is. Anatta is the concept that there is no self, no inherent self, which is whatever you consider yourself to be that is separate from everything else, that is not inherently true. Anatta doesn't relate to any other object other than the self, that there is no inherent self. If you start bringing other ideas in, a body, a human being, a person, etc., that muddies the issue, because we are dealing with the self, which is the notion that what I am, in essence, is something which is separate from everything else. Anyway, bit tricky to get your head around, but if you're not quite clear about it, it might become clearer as I actually do my critique on each individual web page in turn. So anyway, first of all, let's go to the best web page I saw, which I really agreed with, and that's this one. The first web page I'd like to detail is this one, which is DemoWiki.com, and they detail anatta as follows. Anatta means no self, and the doctrine of anatta is the Buddha's most unique and radical teaching. We usually assume that beyond our changing body, mind and experience is an unchanging and unique ego or self. Having identified this self as me, we then identify other things as mine, my spouse, my property, my religion, my country. This, according to the Buddha, is the cause of much of the distress and pain humans inflict upon themselves and others through greed, fear, ignorance, hatred and self-deception. Yeah, I would agree with that. My only slight criticism is just in the details, really. In as much as we say, we usually assume that beyond our changing body, mind, well, straight away with that statement, we're taking the assumption, this body is me, and that is the self. So it's making one step backwards. I would actually change that line to the following. We usually assume that our changing body is us, the self, me. The mind is me, or I have a mind. Experience is mine. And there is an unchanging, unique ego, or self. None of that is inherently true. In fact, the page does go on to state something very similar to what I've just said. The body is not self, feelings are not self, perception is not self, mental constructs are not self, and consciousness is not self. Yeah, that is essentially looking at the Buddhist skandhas, which are all the qualities that the self has, and realizing that each one is not inherently true, that is not the self. And that is the same concept as the concept I believe in Advaita, which is neti neti, which is simply that each statement you say, this is not me, this is not me, this is not me, this is not me, to arrive at a point where you've kind of rejected everything, that what you are, in essence, is beyond description. The next web page is buddhism.stackexchange.com. What is the precise meaning of anatta? And the person on this page poses the question, I often hear anatta explained as being an expression of the non-existence of the self. However, various places add an adjective first. For example, I've heard it said that anatta refers to the non-existence of a permanent self, or a material self, or a separate self, or some combination of those and others. So he's got it essentially right, that anatta is the concept that there is no inherent self. And the person who is answering this question goes on to say, it seems clear to me that it cannot mean the non-existence of a self per se, because such a statement, there is no self, will be auto-refuting. And I agree. And I can explain that in the following way. Anatta is the concept that there is no inherent self. But that does not mean there is no self at all. And the gentleman here has said it's auto-refuting, because you have to detail exactly what you mean by the word self. If you're referring to an inherent self, which is beyond thoughts, words and ideas, then yes, there is no inherent self. But there is a self. It is a concept, a word, a belief, an idea. So obviously if you say there is no self, you're saying there is no word self, there is no concept self. And obviously there is, because you're using it within the sentence. So yes, obviously it's auto-refuting. You have to be careful what exactly you're pointing to. The next page is access-to-insight.org, and they detail the 3 basic facts of existence, egolessness, and there's some links. I won't fully go into this particular page, but I'll just detail my thoughts on the word egolessness. If you're using that word to describe an object or an item that is without ego, that has no ego, then that is not anatta. Anatta is the concept that there is no inherent self. It is not the concept that something is without an ego. And then the next page, which is from hinduwebsite.com, anatta as not self. The Buddha taught the non-existence of eternal souls in the beings. Well, no, sorry. Straight away. Anatta is that there is no inherent... Sorry, I keep repeating myself, but this is it. Anatta is that there is no inherent self. It is not that there isn't a soul or a self inside a being. If you say a being, and within your phrase being you state that is me, then that is the self. So what you don't say is there is no self inside the self. That's the confusion. Whatever you consider yourself to be which is separate from everything else, that is the self. And every reference to that is not inherently true. They go on. He held that the eternal self was an illusion, a notion or formation of the mind. Yes? It had no basis in reality. Okay, yes, I follow that. The next page, from good old Wikipedia. Maybe I should have made this the first one. Anatta. In Buddhism, the term anatta, or anatman, refers to the doctrine of non-self, that there is no unchanging, permanent self, soul, or essence in living beings. Again, same criticism. Living beings. The self is whatever you consider yourself to be that is separate from everything else. So if you consider yourself to be a living being, then that is the self. So what this page is saying, that there is no self inside a self. And that's not true. That is not what anatta is. Anatta is that there is no inherent self. That's it. To fully get into this, if I go through each individual word, it might help to explain it. So there is no unchanging. Okay, that's fine. If you believe that you are permanent and unchanging, that is not inherently true. Permanent self. If you believe that you're permanent, that is not inherently true. Soul. If you believe you're a soul, that is not inherently true. And finally, which is where their landing place, or essence in living beings. But no, you can't state that, because if you believe that you're a living being, that is not inherently true, because a living being would be separate from everything else. They go on, the Buddhist concept of anatta or anatman is one of the fundamental differences between Buddhism and Hinduism, with the latter asserting that atman, self-soul, exists. Yes, that is the difference. In Hinduism, specifically Advaita, there are two forms of self, one with a small s and one with a capital S. The one with the small s is what we're detailing here, a separate individual person or entity. And they also detail the self with a capital S, and that's something different. That relates to like a universal consciousness or universal awareness, something that is infinite and all-encompassing. And as it states on this webpage, they would assert that that is the only thing that exists. Yes, but that isn't a landing place within Buddhism. Not that Buddhism would state that that is incorrect, it just wouldn't be landed upon as a permanent answer. Then we move to the Encyclopedia Britannica, Anatta, and they detail it thus. In Buddhism, it is the doctrine that there is in humans no permanent underlying substance that can be called the soul. No, wrong. Again, I hate to keep repeating myself, but straight away they says there is in humans. Well, straight away they're taking something which is separate. If you believe that you are a human, that is not inherently true, because a human is a separate individual thing, which is equivalent to a self. They go on. Instead, the individual is compounded of 5 factors that are constantly changing. Now, I would agree with that, because that's the Buddhist concept of the skandhas, or heaps, I think they call them, which are qualities, characteristics of the self. And they go on describing it as a departure from Hindu belief in Atman, which is the same as the previous webpage, which I understand. And the final webpage is this one on Buddhanet, Anatta or soullessness. The Buddhist doctrine of rebirth should be distinguished well. I'm not quite sure what they're going on about that, because they're meant to be talking about anatta, which is no inherent self. But straight away they're talking about rebirth and reincarnation. Buddhism denies the existence of an intelligent soul created by a god. Well, again, this has nothing to do with souls or gods. This is to do with the self. I can't really continue with this web page, because although they've stated at the top anatta, majority of the page has nothing to do with anatta. So, unfortunately, with this page, I just have to give up. Okay, well, that's my critique of those particular web pages on the subject of anatta, no self or no inherent self. Hope you found it interesting. Hope you learned something. If you disagree with what I've said, please leave a comment. Always anxious to learn more. My view might be wrong. I'm always willing to listen to other people's views and opinions. Please leave a comment, subscribe or whatever, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye for now.